On a warm afternoon in the summer of 1940, a lone German bomber crossed the English Channel, expecting another routine mission. Below, Britain was running out of pilots, airfields were burning, radar stations were under constant attack. Across Europe, every major army that had stood against Nazi Germany had already fallen. Poland had collapsed in weeks. France had surrendered in just over a month. Norway, Belgium and the Netherlands were gone. Britain was next. Then something appeared out of the sun. Not one aircraft, not a squadron. Hundreds. They climbed faster than anything the Luftwaffe had expected. Their wings flashed silver as they rolled into attack. Their engines screamed with a sound unlike any fighter ever built before. Within minutes, German bombers were falling into the Channel. The aircraft was called the Spitfire. Its silhouette would become one of the most recognisable shapes in military history. It would defend Britain when defeat seemed inevitable. It would fight from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Burma. It would remain in frontline service for nearly 2 decades and become a symbol of an entire nation. But almost nobody remembers the man who designed it. He wasn't a famous military commander. He wasn't a decorated ace. He wasn't even alive to see the aircraft become legendary. Because while Britain was preparing for the greatest war in its history, the man building the fighter that would save it was quietly dying. His name was Reginald Joseph Mitchell, and he knew he was running out of time. This is the story of the engineer who refused to slow down and built the airplane that helped save Britain before his own life came to an end. Reginald Mitchell was born on May the 20th, 1895, in the small town of Butt Lane in Staffordshire, England. Nothing about his childhood suggested he would become one of aviation's greatest designers. His father was a school teacher who later owned a small engineering workshop. Young Reginald preferred sketching machines to playing sports. He dismantled mechanical devices simply to understand how they worked before putting them back together. Teachers noticed something unusual. He wasn't interested in copying existing designs. He constantly asked how they could be improved. At 16, he left school and began an apprenticeship at Kerr Stewart, a locomotive manufacturer producing steam engines for Britain's growing railway network. Steam locomotives demanded precision. Every component had to withstand enormous forces while remaining reliable under constant use. Mitchell absorbed everything: drafting, stress calculations, manufacturing methods, the relationship between weight and strength. Lessons that would later define every aircraft he ever designed. But aviation was changing the world. The Wright brothers had flown only a few years earlier. Across Europe, aircraft were evolving from fragile experimental machines into practical vehicles capable of military service. Mitchell became fascinated. In 1917, during the First World War, he joined the Supermarine Aviation Works in Southampton. At the time, Supermarine was hardly a household name. The company specialised almost entirely in flying boats, large seaplanes designed for the Royal Navy. Their aircraft were practical, reliable, useful, but hardly revolutionary. Mitchell quickly proved different. Unlike many engineers of his generation, he wasn't afraid to ignore conventional wisdom if mathematics suggested a better answer. Within 3 years, he became the company's chief designer. He was only 24 years old. Most engineers spent decades earning that responsibility. Mitchell inherited it before many of his colleagues had reached senior positions. Then peace arrived, and with peace came a problem. Military orders disappeared almost overnight. Aircraft manufacturers across Britain faced bankruptcy. Factories closed. Design teams were laid off. Some companies disappeared completely. Supermarine needed something extraordinary to survive. Ironically, that opportunity came not from war, but from sport. In 1913, newspaper publisher Jacques Schneider had created an international competition unlike anything the world had ever seen, the Schneider Trophy. The rules were simple: build the fastest seaplane on Earth, race it over water. Winner takes the trophy. At first glance, it looked like little more than an expensive sporting event. It wasn't. Governments quickly realised the competition had become a laboratory for military aviation. Every extra mile per hour demanded lighter structures, more powerful engines, cleaner aerodynamics, better cooling systems. Every breakthrough made during the race could eventually be applied to combat aircraft. The Schneider Trophy became Formula One for nations. Britain desperately wanted to win, so did France, Italy, the United States. National pride became attached to every race. Supermarine entered. Mitchell became responsible for designing Britain's Challenger. He immediately approached the problem differently from everyone else. Most designers treated drag as an unavoidable consequence of flight. Mitchell treated drag as the enemy. Every unnecessary rivet, every protruding fitting, every rough surface, every awkward curve. He hunted them relentlessly. He believed speed wasn't created only by adding horsepower. It was created by removing resistance. That philosophy would eventually reshape fighter aviation. His first Schneider aircraft showed promise, but fell short. Many engineers would have blamed the engine. Mitchell blamed the airplane. He redesigned everything, again and again. Each iteration became faster, cleaner, more elegant. He demanded impossible manufacturing tolerances. Panels had to fit perfectly. Surfaces had to remain smooth enough that airflow stayed attached across the wings. Workers often complained. Mitchell rarely accepted compromise. He wasn't cruel. He was obsessed. Then came the masterpiece. The Supermarine S6, powered by the extraordinary Rolls-Royce R engine producing over 2,300 horsepower, it became one of the fastest aircraft on Earth. Its polished metal fuselage reflected sunlight like liquid mercury. Its floats barely touched the water during takeoff. Every line served one purpose: speed. In 1929, Britain won the Schneider Trophy. Mitchell wasn't satisfied. He immediately began improving the aircraft again. 2 years later, the upgraded S6B returned. Average speed, over 340 miles per hour, a staggering achievement for the early 1930s. Britain won the Schneider Trophy permanently. The victory transformed Mitchell into one of Europe's most respected aircraft designers. But something far more important happened behind the scenes. The Schneider races forced engineers to solve problems that military aircraft would soon face. High-speed airflow, thin wings, powerful liquid-cooled engines, advanced propeller design, low-drag construction. Mitchell didn't just build racing airplanes, he accidentally built the foundation for the next generation of fighters. At precisely the moment Europe was beginning to prepare for another war. Germany had not yet openly rearmed, but anyone paying attention could see the direction events were heading. Adolf Hitler had become Chancellor in 1933. The Treaty of Versailles was steadily being ignored. Across Europe, air forces quietly began searching for faster fighters. Britain's Royal Air Force still relied largely on biplanes, aircraft with fixed landing gear, open cockpits, fabric-covered wings. They belonged to another era. Mitchell agreed. He believed future fighters would need entirely different characteristics: high speed, retractable landing gear, enclosed cockpits, all-metal construction. Most importantly, a wing unlike anything currently flying. Many engineers preferred thick wings because they were easier to build and structurally stronger. Mitchell wanted something radically thinner, a wing that sliced through the air instead of pushing against it. The mathematics were difficult. Manufacturing would be even harder. But the potential speed advantage was enormous. It was one of the boldest engineering decisions ever attempted on a fighter aircraft. And before construction could even begin, Mitchell received devastating news. At only 38 years old, Doctors diagnosed him with rectal cancer. The prognosis was grim. Multiple surgeries followed. Friends expected him to retire. Instead, he returned to the drawing board almost immediately, weaker, in constant pain, but more determined than ever, because while Mitchell was fighting for his own life, Europe was preparing for a war that would soon demand the greatest fighter Britain had ever built, and he intended to finish it before time ran out. By 1934, the Royal Air Force finally accepted what many younger officers had been arguing for years. The age of the biplane was ending. Across the English Channel, Germany was rebuilding its air force in secret. New all-metal monoplanes were already appearing on drawing boards. Aircraft speeds were climbing every year, and the Royal Air Force knew that its current fighters would soon be hopelessly obsolete. In November 1934, the Air Ministry issued Specification F.3734. It wasn't a request, it was a warning. Britain needed an entirely new fighter. It had to exceed 300 miles per hour. It had to climb rapidly. It had to carry unprecedented firepower. Most importantly, it had to remain competitive for years, not months. Every major British manufacturer began preparing proposals. Supermarine had no obvious advantage. The company had never built a successful land-based fighter. It was famous for racing seaplanes. Hawker Aircraft, meanwhile, already had years of fighter experience. Its chief designer, Sidney Cam, was developing a rugged new aircraft that would become the Hurricane. Most officials assumed Hawker would win the competition. Mitchell intended to prove them wrong. Instead of starting with existing fighter designs, Mitchell began with the one thing nobody could argue against: physics. Every mile per hour gained in the Schneider Trophy had taught him the same lesson. Power mattered, but drag mattered more. If the engine was the heart of an airplane, then aerodynamics determined whether that heart could actually perform. Mitchell wanted an aircraft so clean that every available horsepower translated directly into speed. Everything became a battle against drag. The cockpit canopy was blended smoothly into the fuselage. The radiator was carefully positioned to minimize turbulence. The landing gear disappeared completely inside the wings after takeoff. Even the rivets were designed to sit flush with the aircraft's skin wherever possible. Each improvement looked small on its own. Together, they transformed the airplane. Then came the wings. This was the decision that separated the future Spitfire from every other fighter in the world. Most contemporary fighters used relatively thick wings because they were easy to manufacture and left plenty of internal space for fuel, landing gear, and machine guns. Mitchell chose something far more ambitious: an extremely thin, elliptical wing. The shape wasn't chosen because it looked beautiful. It was chosen because mathematics demanded it. An elliptical wing produced one of the most efficient lift distributions possible, minimizing induced drag while allowing exceptionally high speed. The theory had existed for decades. Almost nobody had attempted to build it. The curves were extraordinarily difficult to manufacture. Every rib inside the wing had a different shape. Every skin panel required precision. Production engineers immediately warned that the design would be expensive and slow. Mitchell refused to simplify it. If Britain needed the fastest fighter in Europe, then Britain would have to build one. The wing also solved another problem: firepower. Early RAF fighters carried only 2 or 4 machine guns. Combat studies suggested this wasn't enough. Aircraft were becoming stronger, faster, and harder to destroy. Mitchell worked closely with Air Ministry officials who concluded that future fighters would require 8.303 Browning machine guns, 8. Many critics thought the idea was excessive. Mitchell designed for it anyway. The remarkably thin wing somehow accommodated all 8 guns, their ammunition and retractable landing gear without compromising aerodynamic performance. It was an engineering puzzle that many believed impossible. Yet somehow, it worked. At the centre of the aircraft sat another revolution, the Rolls-Royce PV-12 engine. The name sounded unremarkable. The engine wasn't. Still under development, the PV-12 would eventually receive a far more famous name: Merlin. It was a liquid-cooled V12 capable of producing over 1,000 horsepower, an astonishing figure for the mid-1930s. Mitchell had worked closely with Rolls-Royce engineers during the Schneider Trophy years and immediately recognised its potential. The engine and the airframe seemed almost designed for each other. The slim Merlin allowed an exceptionally narrow nose, reducing drag while improving the pilot's forward visibility. As the engine grew more powerful, Mitchell continuously refined the aircraft around it. Every extra horsepower deserved an equally efficient airframe. Engine and airplane evolved together. One without the other would never have achieved greatness. Construction of the prototype began in earnest during 1935. Inside Supermarine's Southampton factory, the atmosphere bordered on obsession. Mitchell was everywhere. He inspected drawings, reviewed stress calculations, questioned manufacturing tolerances, walked the assembly floor despite constant pain from repeated cancer treatments. His colleagues noticed the change. He had become noticeably thinner. Fatigue followed him constantly, but his work ethic only intensified. Friends urged him to rest. Doctors insisted he slow down. Mitchell ignored both. He reportedly told colleagues there simply wasn't time. Looking back, the statement carried two meanings. Europe was running out of peace, and Mitchell was running out of life. By early 1936, the prototype stood complete. Officially, it was called the Type 300. The name Spitfire almost never happened. The Air Ministry originally disliked it. Some officials considered it too informal for a military aircraft. The name had reportedly come from Sir Robert Maclean, chairman of Vickers, who affectionately used Little Spitfire to describe his spirited young daughter. Mitchell himself preferred the simpler designation, Type 300. But the nickname remained. Eventually, the Air Ministry accepted it. History would never remember the aircraft by any other name. On March 5th, 1936, test pilot Joseph Mutt Summers climbed into the cockpit at Eastleigh Airfield. Thousands of hours of design work now depended on a single flight. The Merlin engine roared to life. The aircraft accelerated. Its narrow landing gear made takeoff delicate. Then the wheels left the runway for the first time. The Spitfire flew. Observers watched nervously from below. Every experimental aircraft carried risk. Some prototypes barely remained airborne. Others crashed on their first attempt. The Spitfire looked different. It climbed smoothly, balanced perfectly, responsive, elegant. After landing, Summers climbed out wearing an unmistakable grin. He reportedly delivered one of aviation history's most famous test pilot assessments. "I don't want anything touched. For an engineer, there was no greater compliment." Testing continued throughout the year. The numbers stunned everyone involved. Top speed exceeded expectations. Handling was exceptional. The aircraft climbed faster than virtually every fighter then flying. Pilots repeatedly praised its harmony. The controls felt perfectly balanced. Nothing seemed heavy. Nothing seemed unpredictable. It responded almost instinctively. Many later described flying the Spitfire as wearing the airplane rather than sitting inside it. Mitchell had achieved something almost impossible: raw performance without sacrificing grace. The Air Ministry moved quickly. In June 1936, before testing had even finished, Britain ordered 310 aircraft. It was one of the largest peacetime fighter contracts ever placed by the RAF. The decision carried enormous risk. The Spitfire remained largely unproven. Mass production had never been attempted. Its complex elliptical wing worried manufacturers. Britain was effectively betting its future air defence on an aircraft still completing flight trials. Fortunately, another aircraft was entering production alongside it. Sydney Cam's Hawker Hurricane. If the Hurricane represented rugged practicality, the Spitfire represented engineering brilliance. One would become Britain's dependable workhorse. The other would become its razor. Together, they would soon face the greatest air assault in British history. Mitchell should have enjoyed the triumph. The prototype had flown. The production order was secured. His revolutionary fighter was becoming reality. Instead, his health collapsed. The cancer spread despite repeated operations. Simple tasks exhausted him. Meetings became shorter. Colleagues quietly assumed others would soon inherit the project. Yet Mitchell continued refining every detail. He reviewed production drawings from his home. He dictated engineering changes. He remained involved until his body simply refused to cooperate. On June 11, 1937, Reginald Joseph Mitchell died. He was only 42 years old. He never saw a production Spitfire leave the factory. He never watched one intercept a German bomber. He never heard the Merlin engine echo across southern England during the Battle of Britain. He never knew that the aircraft he had sacrificed his remaining years to create would become the symbol of Britain's survival. His chief assistant, Joseph Smith, inherited the project. Smith understood something immediately. Mitchell had already gotten the difficult decisions right. His job wasn't to redesign the Spitfire, it was to preserve its genius while making it ready for war. And war was now only 2 years away. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain declared war. The conflict Reginald Mitchell had spent the final years of his life preparing for had finally arrived. But there was a problem. The Royal Air Force still didn't have enough Spitfires. Despite the large production order placed in 1936, manufacturing the aircraft had proven far more difficult than anyone expected. The very feature that made the Spitfire exceptional, its beautifully curved elliptical wing, also made it incredibly labour-intensive to build. Each wing contained hundreds of precisely fitted components. No two ribs were identical. Every panel demanded remarkable craftsmanship. Factories that could quickly produce the simpler Hawker Hurricane struggled to match the Spitfire's complexity. By the outbreak of war, only a few hundred had entered service. The Hurricane would carry the burden during the war's opening months. The Spitfire's moment had not yet come. Then Europe collapsed. Poland fell. Denmark fell. Norway fell. In May 1940, Germany launched its offensive into Belgium, the Netherlands and France. The Blitzkrieg moved with terrifying speed. Entire armies were surrounded before commanders even understood where the front line had gone. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. German bombers struck bridges, roads, railways and airfields with devastating precision. British squadrons crossed the Channel to support France, but the odds were overwhelming. The RAF lost aircraft faster than factories could replace them. Then came Dunkirk. More than 330,000 Allied soldiers were trapped against the sea. If they were captured, Britain would lose the core of its professional army. The Royal Navy launched the largest evacuation in its history. Civilian boats joined destroyers, ferries, fishing vessels, anything that could float. Above them, the Luftwaffe hunted relentlessly. Spitfire squadrons flew constant patrols over the beaches. Many soldiers waiting below never saw them. The dogfights happened thousands of feet overhead. Some later believed the RAF had abandoned them. The reality was exactly the opposite. Pilots fought continuously to keep German bombers away from the evacuation fleet. The Spitfire was finally proving what Mitchell had designed it to do: not dominate headlines, protect lives. France surrendered on June 22, 1940. Britain now stood alone. Across the English Channel, Adolf Hitler prepared Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. But before German troops could cross the Channel, one obstacle had to disappear: the Royal Air Force. Without air superiority pose, an amphibious invasion would be suicide. the Luftwaffe's mission became brutally simple. Destroy Fighter Command, destroy Britain's airfields, destroy its aircraft on the ground, destroy its pilots in the air. Once the Royal Air Force was gone, Britain would follow. The battle that began in July 1940 would become known simply as the Battle of Britain. The numbers looked terrifying. Germany could field roughly 2,500 combat aircraft. Britain had barely 700 operational fighters available at any one time. Many squadrons flew multiple sorties every day. Pilots often landed only long enough to refuel and reload before scrambling again. Exhaustion became constant. Some flew 4 or 5 combat missions daily. Many were barely 20 years old. The average life expectancy for a new fighter pilot during the battle could be measured in weeks. Despite its legendary reputation today, the Spitfire did not fight alone. Nearly 2/3 of Royal Air Force Fighter Command actually flew Hurricanes. The Hurricane shot down more enemy aircraft overall during the battle because there were simply more of them. But the Spitfire performed a different role. It hunted Germany's fighters. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf 109 was one of the finest fighters in the world. Fast, powerful, deadly. It escorted German bombers across southern England, seeking to destroy the Royal Air Force before the bombers reached their targets. The Spitfire became its primary opponent. The matchup would define fighter aviation. On paper, the two aircraft appeared remarkably similar. Both exceeded 350 miles per hour. Both carried powerful armament. Both featured all-metal construction. But they fought differently. The Bf 109 climbed slightly faster. It accelerated more aggressively in a dive. Its fuel-injected engine continued running during negative G maneuvers. The Merlin engine initially could not. If a Spitfire pilot pushed the nose down abruptly, fuel starvation could briefly cut engine power. German pilots exploited the weakness whenever possible. Yet the Spitfire possessed an advantage almost every pilot immediately recognized. It turned beautifully. Its elliptical wing generated extraordinary lift with remarkably little drag. In a sustained turning fight, skilled Royal Air Force pilots could often outmaneuver the Messerschmitt. Many describe the aircraft as almost intuitive. The machine seemed to anticipate what the pilot wanted before he finished moving the controls. Years later, veteran pilots still struggled to explain exactly why. One simply said, "The Spitfire felt alive. Day after day, the battle intensified. Radar stations detected incoming raids. Observers tracked formations visually. Operations rooms directed squadrons toward approaching bombers. Ground controllers spoke calmly over the radio, while hundreds of aircraft converged over southern England. The system itself became a weapon." Britain did not waste fuel searching for the enemy. It knew where the enemy was coming from. The Spitfire simply met them there. Some engagements lasted only minutes. Others descended into chaotic turning battles involving dozens of fighters. Contrails crisscrossed the sky. Machine guns stitched across clouds. Burning aircraft spiraled toward fields below. Sometimes parachutes opened. Sometimes they did not. The Luftwaffe expected victory within weeks. Instead, losses mounted. German bomber crews discovered that no raid over Britain would go unchallenged. Every time they crossed the coast, Spitfires appeared, again and again. The aircraft became more than a machine. It became uncertainty. No bomber crew knew when the attack would come. Only that eventually it would. Then Germany made one of the most consequential strategic mistakes of the entire war. In late August, several German bombers accidentally dropped bombs on London. Britain retaliated by bombing Berlin. Hitler was furious. He ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its focus. Instead of relentlessly attacking RAF airfields and fighter command infrastructure, German bombers would now target British cities. The Blitz had begun. For civilians, it was a catastrophe. For fighter command, it was a lifeline. Airfields received precious time to repair runways. Aircraft factories continued operating. Pilots could rotate, reorganize, and recover. The pressure that had nearly broken the RAF suddenly eased. Many historians have argued that this decision fundamentally changed the course of the battle. By October 1940, Germany quietly abandoned its attempt to destroy Fighter Command. Operation Sea Lion was indefinitely postponed. Britain had survived. The Spitfire did not win the Battle of Britain alone. No single aircraft did. Radar mattered, ground crews mattered, factory workers mattered, the Hurricane mattered, the pilots mattered most of all. But whenever the RAF needed an aircraft capable of meeting Germany's best fighter on equal terms, they turned to Mitchell's creation, the airplane whose designer had never lived to see a single shot fired. The victory transformed the Spitfire into a national symbol. Factories expanded production at astonishing speed. Women entered assembly lines in record numbers. Shadow factories opened across Britain to avoid concentrated bombing. Every improvement made the aircraft slightly faster, slightly stronger, slightly deadlier. New Merlin engines increased power. Later variants introduced clipped wings for lower altitude performance. Others extended the wings for high altitude interception. The Spitfire evolved constantly because the war demanded it. By 1941, it was no longer simply defending Britain. It was crossing the Channel, escorting bombers, attacking occupied Europe, preparing for a much larger war. But even as the Spitfire grew more powerful, a new threat was already appearing over Germany, one unlike anything pilots had ever faced before. Aircraft that did not use propellers at all. And soon, even the magnificent Spitfire would have to fight to remain relevant against the dawn of the jet age. By 1942, the Spitfire had already achieved what most military aircraft never do. It had become a legend while the war was still being fought. But legends have a problem. The enemy adapts. The Luftwaffe introduced improved versions of the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Then came the formidable Focke-Wulf FW 190, a fighter so capable that many RAF pilots initially believed that they were facing an entirely new class of aircraft. The FW 190 was faster at low altitude. It rolled more quickly. It accelerated harder. For the first time since the Battle of Britain, the Spitfire was no longer unquestionably superior. The RAF suddenly found itself in the same position Germany had faced 2 years earlier. Its greatest fighter risked becoming obsolete. Fortunately, Reginald Mitchell's design still had room to grow. Mitchell had never built the Spitfire around a single engine. He had built it around an idea. A clean airframe with exceptional aerodynamic efficiency could absorb more power as engines improved. That decision would save the aircraft. Rolls-Royce continued developing the Merlin engine throughout the war. From roughly 1,000 horsepower in the earliest variants, later Merlins produced well over 1,500 horsepower. Each increase demanded new propellers, strengthened airframes, revised cooling systems, and subtle aerodynamic refinements. Joseph Smith, Mitchell's successor, carefully evolved the aircraft without destroying the balance that had made it famous. The Spitfire Mark V gave way to the Mark IX. The Mark IX restored parity with the FW-190 almost overnight. Many historians consider it one of the finest piston engine fighters ever built. Later came the Griffon-powered variants. The new Rolls-Royce Griffon engine transformed the Spitfire once again. With over 2,000 horsepower, the aircraft exceeded 440 miles per hour. The elegant fighter of 1936 had become something entirely different, a machine powerful enough to challenge almost anything in the sky. The Spitfire fought almost everywhere, over the deserts of North Africa, across the frozen skies of Northern Europe, over Malta, where exhausted RAF pilots defended one of the most heavily bombed islands of the war, in Italy, Burma, India, Australia, the Pacific. Even after the D-Day landings in June 1944, Spitfires flew thousands of sorties supporting Allied troops advancing across France. By then, Many served as fighter bombers, carrying bombs beneath their wings before returning to air superiority missions the very same day. Others became photographic reconnaissance aircraft. Their guns were removed. Extra fuel tanks and cameras took their place. Painted in a distinctive pale blue, these unarmed Spitfires flew alone over occupied Europe at extreme altitude and speed, photographing factories, ports, railways, and German troop movements. Their survival depended entirely on the performance Mitchell had designed into the aircraft years earlier. If they were caught, they had only one defence: outrun the enemy. Many did. Then came the greatest technological challenge of the war. In 1944, Germany introduced the Messerschmitt Ma-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was faster than anything powered by a piston engine. It was more than 100 miles per hour faster than most Allied fighters. No Spitfire could simply chase one down. The age of the propeller was ending, yet the Spitfire still found ways to fight. RAF pilots learned to attack Me-262s during takeoff and landing, when their jet engines accelerated slowly and the aircraft was most vulnerable. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fair, but war rarely is. Even against technology a generation ahead of its own, the Spitfire remained relevant until the final months of the conflict. Very few aircraft can claim that. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, more than 20,000 Spitfires had been built. Production would continue even after the war. In total, over 20,300 examples rolled off British production lines in 24 major variants. Few combat aircraft have ever enjoyed such a remarkable evolution. Fewer still remained competitive throughout an entire world war. Most fighters become obsolete within a few years. The Spitfire adapted again and again and again. Its influence stretched far beyond Britain. More than 30 nations eventually operated the aircraft. It served with the air forces of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, France, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, India, Israel, and many others. Some remained in frontline service into the 1950s. Others continued flying as trainers and reconnaissance aircraft long after newer jets had entered service. Today, decades after the last military Spitfire retired, dozens remain airworthy. Their Merlin engines still produce the same unmistakable sound that echoed across southern England in 1940. At airshows, spectators often stop talking the moment they hear it. Not because it's the loudest engine, because it's one of the most recognisable, a sound that has become inseparable from Britain's story. And yet, Reginald Mitchell never heard any of it. He never watched Spitfires rise to intercept incoming bombers during the Battle of Britain. He never saw photographs of smiling RAF pilots standing beside the aircraft he designed. He never witnessed D-Day. He never knew his fighter would become one of the greatest engineering achievements of the 20th century. When he died in June 1937, the Spitfire existed only as a handful of prototypes and a promise. Everything that made it legendary happened after he was gone. His greatest success arrived too late for him to see. History often celebrates generals, politicians, aces, the names that appear in newspapers. But wars are also won by engineers, by people sitting over drawing boards, solving problems that nobody else notices until years later. Mitchell never fired a shot in the Second World War, yet thousands of Allied pilots trusted their lives to decisions he made with a pencil years before the fighting began. The shape of the wing, the placement of the radiator, the strength of the airframe. The choice to prioritize aerodynamic efficiency above everything else. Small decisions, each one almost invisible. Together, they helped preserve Britain's control of the skies during its darkest hour. Winston Churchill famously declared, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." He was speaking about the RAF pilots. But those few also owed something to one quiet engineer who never lived to meet them. The Spitfire wasn't the most heavily armed fighter of the war. It wasn't the fastest by 1945. It wasn't the easiest to build. It wasn't even the most numerous British fighter. What made it extraordinary was something much rarer. It started so far ahead of its time that it remained relevant through 6 years of relentless technological change. That almost never happens in military engineering. Most revolutionary machines enjoy a brief moment before being surpassed. The Spitfire simply kept evolving. Mitchell had designed an airplane with room to grow, and that may have been his greatest achievement of all. He didn't just solve Britain's problems in 1936, he solved problems Britain hadn't encountered yet. Few engineers leave behind a machine. Fewer leave behind a symbol. Reginald Mitchell left both. And every time a Spitfire climbs into the sky today, its elliptical wings catching the sunlight exactly as he imagined nearly 90 years ago. His work flies with it. If you enjoyed this story and want more deep dives into the engineering, history, and untold stories behind the machines that changed the world, make sure to subscribe.